Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us again at API Days Interface. For those of you who are just joining this API security track, my name is Christine Bevilacqua. I am with the group over at AppSec University, and I'll be your MC/host for the rest of the afternoon. Our next guest probably doesn't need much introduction for any of you who follow security or API security specifically. John Hammond is joining us, and he is going to talk with us about APIs and APTs and manipulating access in current events. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hey, it's great to be here. This is going to be a ton of fun, and I'm just flattered for the opportunity.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having you here, and I'm excited to learn from you for the next 25 minutes.
Fingers crossed.
Take it away.
All righty. Well, hey, I suppose we can pull up the slides if that's A-okay. And well, hey, talk title, right? Session presentation is APIs and APTs. So APTs, if you aren't too familiar with that end, is the advanced persistent threat. A whole lot of hackers and adversaries and threat actors in that cybersecurity space, right? So I want to dig into manipulating access and kind of tampering with the API for current events. Before we dive in too far, hey, seriously, thank you. Really appreciate getting the chance to spend some time with you all. And thank you for hanging out and just being here. So I can't say that enough, and you'll hear me say it again and again and way too often. But anyway, this whole smattering of a slide, and forgive me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to be this giant wall of text. I tried to fade out maybe the parts that aren't as important, but this is genuinely the abstract for what we're going to be diving into. And I tried to highlight, or at least relatively emphasize, the important parts that can help set the stage. So this is current, this is recent, this is like this month or last month, depending on really your definition. Following the Memorial Day weekend of 2023 this year, a whole lot of us nerds, geeks, security researchers have been trying to dig into this MoveIt Transfer exploitation. Now, if you haven't heard of it, there has been a little bit of commotion, catching some waves in the news and headlines and across journalists and reporters here. But we're sort of in the aftermath following, okay, the incident, the breaches, and following. I know that big, bad B word, but I would love to get a little bit nerdy and a little bit geeky and talk to you about some of the attack chain, because importantly, and I think really unique, it utilizes a bit of the API for the application, for the software called MoveIt. And there is one tiny gimmick in there that I think is interesting. It's not strictly a vulnerability within APIs. It's just taking advantage of and using the API to do further damage. But I thought it was one interesting oddball and would at least help kind of tell the story here. So thanks so much. Bearing with me. This is it. This is Progress MoveIt Transfer. MoveIt Transfer is the name of a file sharing application that is meant to transfer files back and forth, whether it's over like SFTP, the secure file transfer protocol, or some in HTTP, it has a web interface, etc. And it caught some wind from this provider and the vendor named Progress. But all of these news articles and outlets are chatting about this critical vulnerability. And that turned out to be SQL injection. I don't know if folks are tracking. SQL is that structured query language to work with databases and websites. Hey, you log in. Hey, you interact with maybe a shopping cart if you're going to go purchase something on Amazon or eBay or whatever. A lot of that data is tracked naturally in the database. But SQL injection lets you tamper with that. So interesting thing. All of these headlines leading up and tracking, CISA, like the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, they were tracking it. It's added to their KEV, or their knowledge base of known exploited vulnerabilities. And it's really catching some waves. So, hey, I'd love to dive into it, but I do want to foot stomp, and forgive the military term there, right? I do want to emphasize that this is still kind of ongoing. Right. Very modern and current topic here. This is an article from Ars Technica dated yesterday, chatting about all of the other organizations, businesses, groups, and companies that are kind of coming out of the woodwork to express and say, hey, we've been affected. Hey, whether it's us specifically, maybe we use MoveIt, the software in this application internally, or we rely on a third-party vendor or something across the supply chain, right? Buzzword, that impacts and affects them. And we started slow with a couple victims coming out. Hey, British Airways, Aer Lingus, the BBC, now other organizations like the New York City Department of Education and other electrical companies all saying there's data that's been published. Information of theirs has been stolen and put out on the open internet. That's been the danger with this MoveIt exploitation. Now, I promise I will get to the nerdy gritty API stuff, but I do want to give a little bit more context and a backdrop in here because as the story has been able to unfold, this got dubbed with a CVE or sort of an ID number for this exploit and vulnerability. This was CVE 2023 34362. That number has been ingrained into my mind as we've been trying to chase this thing for the past couple days and weeks. And Microsoft goes out and says, hey, we're going to attribute this to, point the finger at this group, this threat actor sort of cluster that they call Lace Tempest. Now, for those in the security world, hey, you might be familiar, Microsoft has been trying to change a couple of the naming schemes and name standards for tracked adversaries and groups. But a lot of folks might refer to this as like FIN11 or TA505 if you're in that cyber threat intelligence world. It all boils down to a ransomware gang. Now, if folks aren't familiar with other ransomware gangs, you have Conti, you have Lockbit, you have Black Basta, Babook, tons of these. Another one is called Clop, and they try to stylize their name with like a 0 for the letter O to be all elite and cool, right? And Clop was allegedly the threat actor behind this MoveIt exploitation. Now, Clop has done similar things in the past, and it's sort of their style to do this. Like, I don't know if folks were tracking the Go Anywhere MFT, another file transfer application that was exploited and had caught some time in the limelight because of those vulnerabilities. Ultimately, the Clop ransomware gang did come out and say, like, hey, little chest thumpy, put a flag in the ground, claim responsibility for this. And on their dark web, Onion, Tor hidden services leak site, right? They say, this was us. Dear companies, hey, this is an announcement to educate folks who use this. Pay attention to this process because we are going to set a timer until June 14th was the original date as to when the victims would then reach out to them to deal with the aftermath. Because if they aren't paid in this blackmail and extortion as a ransomware gang would do, then they'll publish all the data, all the information that they stole. Now, today, it is obviously not June 14th. We're up to June 28th, I believe. This is Clop's website at the moment. I took the screenshot this morning, and you can see all of the organizations, all the domains, all the businesses, potential companies, right, that have had a page go up on that dark web Tor leak site following this MoveIt transfer exploitation. They give some updates. Hey, files published for this company, files published for business ABC, files published for vendor XYZ. I got to be honest, I think we're going to see a little bit more of that still in the coming days. There's been a slow drip to getting these things in about. But forgive me, I'm sorry. I know we should be chatting about some API security. Now, with a little bit of that background and a little bit of that backdrop, let's dig into the threat. Let's dig into the exploit and the vulnerability. Again, this was 34362, that ID number that starts with SQL injection. It starts with modifying the database or manipulating the backend web server to mistake what is normally data, like a user entering their name, giving it to the website, but instead of their name, they add some extra syntax to do some more damage. And it tricks and fools the database into executing code. But that's not an API. The next part is the API. So let me get a little bit nerdy. Let me show you. This is what the MoveIt transfer application really looks like. We spun it up in a local environment, some sandbox to do some testing, to try and understand this, do security research and analyze things. And you'll note, hey, it asks for a username and password, right? You need credentials or authentication to log in. But with the SQL injection, you could bypass that. Bypass authentication, and the threat actors or any adversary, right, does not need username and password. And this is all in their web interface, right? This is how you navigate to it within your web browser, Google Chrome or Firefox. So interestingly enough, the web server should be storing logs. They should be keeping track of, hey, what IP address goes from one session to another and what pages they visit. So while we're trying to do what we call our rapid response and dig into this and analyze it, we had one organization, one endpoint that we're protecting, hey, one business that we're trying to help support in security. They were affected. And we're thinking, wow, okay, dang, we had like perspective and visibility over 2 million endpoints, and only one of them looks like they were compromised. Small stuff to start with, but now we're seeing more and more come out of the woodwork. I think honestly, there were about single digits, maybe 10 that had this installed across our partner base. But we got to dig in and take a look through those IIS logs, the Internet Information Services, the web server for hosting applications. And this is it. Take a look. And I don't want to get too nerdy, but I think we are going to have some fun here. We should be able to see, okay, they request the homepage with a GET request. They post to this guestaccess.aspx web page, that endpoint. And then all of a sudden they start to play with the API. They start to post to the API, grabbing a token, then start to pull down different folders, things that might be internal to the application. Okay, the files that are being shared within this file sharing application. And they presumably start to upload a file. They play with some other DLLs that might refer to a more low-level API, IS API. And then they go ahead and continue, maybe presumably an old file that they were trying to stage or upload. Now, anyway, I've tried to drill down and focus in on those API portions because I think that's the focus here. I don't want to get too far deep into the SQL injection or the remote code execution, but I'd be more than happy to talk offline. But let's focus on the API because that's what we're here to chat about. So here's the thing. MoveIt Transfer API is a REST API, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that, right? Hey, simple GET, POST requests, other HTTP methods. And their documentation is open and available. Like it's on the internet. You can Google, you can track it down for whatever version of the software that you're up against or playing with. And this is handy because hey, from a security researcher point of view, that really, really helps try to understand what they're doing or how they got there. We weren't able to see a whole lot more details in those IIS logs. Like we can't see headers. We can't see all the arguments that they might include in the post request. But at least it clues us in on some of that functionality. So the MoveIt Transfer API offers a couple different features and functionality, right? Stuff that lets you work with the application, whether it's viewing mailboxes, whether it's tracking files, whether it's getting info, whether it's checking out contacts, etc. But the only way you interact with it is through a token, an API token. Now, that was the first thing that they went to. The gimmick is that you would need credentials seemingly to be able to grab an API token to where your, hey, my name is, and let the website trust you. But how did they get credentials if the threat actors are adversaries? Because they presumably performed an authentication bypass where they didn't need a username or password. So how are they getting this API token? Now, you might think, and of course, a knee-jerk reaction, well, they had SQL injection. They could probably just pull or reach from the database of username and passwords. Well, they're encrypted, right? They're hashed as they should be. You won't be able to determine how they're encrypted because the keys are stored in the Windows registry, which is a little bit too nerdy. They wouldn't have access to that. So what did they do? In the documentation, they talk about, hey, you could refresh a token or supply a password or use a one-time password PIN. But that didn't really answer the question. Even if you looked into the database, we opened up, hey, MySQL Workbench, Microsoft SQL. We tried to see what tables they might have been able to access and how they manipulated things. They don't keep track of a user and password like session table. They keep track of active sessions that only exist while a user is logged in. So they wouldn't have been able to pull down credentials. Kind of a weird, wild thing. But it still leaves a wondering question. How did they get access to the API? At least according to the documentation, there's no real way other than creds. But if we got a little bit more nerdy if we got a little bit more of that reverse engineer, hey, security researcher aspect to it, you could drill down and dig into the code. You could reverse engineer the DLLs, the ASPX files, the code behind, and you could see how are they actually implementing all of this. Now, I realize this is not an epiphany aha moment. It's nothing extremely novel or ingenious. It's just something that wasn't included in the documentation. It's undocumented, so to speak. If you already had a session, if you could bypass authentication and were granted whatever cookies allowed you to interact with the web page, you had your foot in the door. You're good. You can just say, hey, use my current session as my authentication scheme. And that way they could manipulate themselves, say, I'm the admin by inserting into the database for active sessions, and then just use my current active session. That's the keys of the kingdom, because then they could go back and do all the manipulation that they did, changing files, uploading things, creating new folders, and then do whatever damage they might. Again, I won't drill down into all the remote code execution aspect, but I thought for the API sake, that was at least interesting. And I don't know how much we might be able to take away from that, truthfully, because it's an undocumented thing. Okay, cool. But also having the functionality to use your current session to work with the API is totally normal. Like, I think that's natural. I don't know about you. I'd love to learn. I don't know if there's a whole lot to take away from this, but maybe that's one thing that helps us better understand how actors, threat actors, hackers might be able to really use APIs, even if in different corners and crevices of a website. If there's another vulnerability, if there's another gaping hole or weakness, that could still leverage getting the whole brains of the application, because that API lets you do anything for the application. Now, I will nerd out just a little bit because I think it would be cool to include some fireworks. We had done our due diligence to reverse engineer and analyze this and recreate this attack chain. And I was really, really proud of that work. I think, honestly, we were probably the first to the punch there. We got to dig in and we fully understood and made a proof of concept for the exploit before anyone else did. And that was really, really fulfilling. Even if it's like a, hey, we need to patch, hey, we need to do the defense, hey, we need to get security right. Still understanding the offense is critical. It is invaluable when trying to better your defense. So let me show you this, if that's a-okay. I pulled up what would have been our demonstration for exploitation. Now, I want to pay one really close attention. I would like you to zoom in and take a look at this as I fire this off. In the middle section here of our threat actor, hacker, play pretend, Kali Linux, on the right-hand side is where our victim, the MoveIt Transfer application, is. But on the left middle is where we run the exploit script. And I want you to take a look at the API token that's leaked. Now, it's not going to be anything novel. Again, you've seen APIs before, right? But I think it is a cool, interesting tidbit. Starting small, hey, we stage Meterpreter, Metasploit, just so we can gain a shell, get access, compromise the thing, blah, blah, blah. But when we fire off our own Python script, take a look, and I'll pause it right here. We grab a session ID value for our current session. We trigger SQL injection, pull down the admin session that we want to work with, and then we grab the API token because we have the permissions and privileges to do that with the session that we've just carved out of thin air for ourselves. We start a file upload. We do some deserialization exploits to get Meterpreter and finally have code execution. And that we are, in fact, the MoveIt service. We have compromised that server. Now, that's not very visual. So if we wanted to light off the fireworks here, what we do is we drop ransomware. We start to exploit the thing. Now, note, in the current attack chain that the world has been seeing, Clop did not drop ransomware. It was only stealing data and exfiltration. But now, hey, you can see, hey, all the files have been encrypted. You've got your ransomware note, and there's that spooky, scary, sexy hacker stuff in action here. Obviously, going to the MoveIt application, it's totally broken because all the files are encrypted. Anyway, sorry, I know we're cutting up at the very end of things here. I do want to note that because we got to do some more of this research, we got to uncover other potential vulnerabilities. Not strictly in the API, but just things that could, again, lead to the sensitive API power. More SQL injection. we got to dig in and we got a new CVE assigned that's now been patched, and all of these things have been patched, and the vendor's doing great work to keep everyone's ear to the ground and make sure we are patching together. And that's the biggest thing I'd love to be able to drive home for sort of the last point here as we're wrapping up on time. Look, we're a bunch of geeks and nerds and security researchers and analysts and SOC responders and incident responders and detection engineers, or ethical hackers, penetration testers, and red teamers digging into security, whether it's API security or any of the other wild world and directions we can run in for our industry. It's up to us. Like, hey, the onus is on us. When something catches fire or hits the fan, right? We should be the one digging into the action and trying to help, because that's where all the action is, and the best way we can kind of keep putting our best foot forward, even amongst some APIs. And maybe that undocumented feature could be worth drilling into and figuring out some other gaps and holes and weaknesses, not just in this example, but plenty of others. And with that, it's up to us. So, hey, thanks so much for listening. I think we have a couple moments for questions. Is that right? And I'd love to hear what you all are thinking.
Oh, sorry. There I am. We do have a couple of minutes for questions. So if anyone's got more questions for John, feel free to drop them in the comments on this session. But John, I thank you for sharing that. That was super fascinating dive into what is a very topical hack right now. And I think that it's good for all of us to kind of see behind how these are found, and then how we all work as a community, to your point, right, to help mitigate the damage once found, but ideally find these and plug loopholes ahead of time. There was a chat this morning, probably too early your time for you to catch it, but one of the very first sessions that we had was on hacking cars, and one of the statistics that they shared that was scary to me was just the percentage of all exploits or all hacks that are happening now in the automobile industry. It was like 65% are black hat exploits, and that's scary, right? That the bad actors are so significantly outweighing the good actors, especially when you think about something like vehicles and what could happen when you're hacking into APIs that power those vehicles. So great rallying cry and call to action. I think that they were just asking if we could share again what the Discord channel is so that everybody can access that, and I can put it in the chat.
Oh, is that for myself and my Discord?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Let me see if I can drop a link and verify that still works.
Yeah, awesome. And while you're doing that, so I would just say, are there specific communities or places? Your rallying cry was for all of us to come together. Where, if people want to get more involved, if they want to learn more about how to do what you all at Huntress do, what are some good resources? Or are there other places, channels, communities that maybe those of our audience who are more new to API security, where we can point them?
Super good question. Well, hey, if I may, I'd love to give a little bit of a plug for API University. They've got a great book and all the great things that they're up to. But for more of the, hey, maybe in the weeds on the keyboard technical stuff to get started, hey, truthfully, I'm a really, really big believer in hands-on learning with like capture the flag, even simple stuff that makes it a game, that makes it fun, because there's so much information already out there. And if you're willing to, I don't know, go take a look at Google, go do some research, go maybe try a game that's upcoming on ctftime.org, or I don't know, you could try some practice stuff like Try Hack Me or Hack the Box or Pico CTF. There's an endless list of resources out there. And of course, hey, YouTube, there are plenty of teachers out there, and I try to throw my hat in the ring just as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I did not drop the Discord channel yet in the comments, but I will. For those of you who are asking, I'll drop those post-session. We are at time, but thank you. That was really interesting and fascinating and very topical. I appreciate it.
Happy to hear it. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, John. Have a great afternoon.